the weight of the world pressed down on Millie Calloway's shoulders. Eviction loomed, a cruel landlord's threat echoing in her ears. She clutched the phone, her fingers white-knuckled, desperation clinging to her like a shroud. Finding a job in the city was hard enough, but a felony conviction? It felt like a scarlet letter, branding her as an outcast. Days bled into nights, each one colder and more hopeless than the last. The city, once a beacon of opportunity, now felt like a cage, its steel bars forged from her past mistakes. But Millie was a survivor. She'd clawed her way back from the abyss before, her spirit tempered by hardship. This latest setback wouldn't break her, not while she still had breath in her lungs and fight in her heart. She would find a way. She always did. The phone's shrill ring cut through the silence of Millie's tiny apartment. She snatched it up, her heart leaping into her throat. Could this be it? The lifeline she'd been praying for? The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, the epitome of wealth and privilege. Douglas Garrick. He was calling about the housemaid position. He spoke of his wife, Wendy, her voice laced with concern. She was unwell, in need of a helping hand. He painted a picture of a loving husband desperate to ease his wife's suffering. Millie listened, her skepticism battling with a flicker of hope. Could this be the answer to her prayers? Mr. Garrick seemed more interested in her discretion than her qualifications. He offered her the job on the spot, his generosity bordering on the excessive. Millie hesitated, a knot of unease twisting in her stomach, but hope lingered in her heart. The Garricks' penthouse apartment was a world away from Millie's cramped, threadbare existence. Opulence oozed from every pore of the place, from the shimmering marble floors to the priceless artwork adorning the walls. It was a gilded cage, a testament to their wealth and her own precarious position. Wendy Garrick was nothing like Millie had expected. She was young, beautiful, her eyes reflecting a deep-seated sadness that belied her husband's cheerful facade. Their interactions were strained, shrouded in an awkward silence that spoke volumes. As the days turned into weeks, Millie couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The Garricks' carefully constructed facade began to crumble, revealing glimpses of the darkness that lurked beneath. Millie couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that she'd stumbled into something sinister, something far more complex than a simple housemaid position. The tension in the penthouse was as thick as the expensive perfume that clung to Wendy Garrick like a shroud. Millie moved through the luxurious rooms, her senses on high alert. She caught snippets of hushed conversations. Douglas's voice low and menacing, Wendy's a barely audible whimper. The air crackled with unspoken threats, the silence punctuated by the clinking of ice in a crystal glass. One evening, while polishing the grand piano, Millie heard a crash from the guest bedroom. It was followed by a string of muffled sobs, sending a shiver down her spine. She crept closer, her hand hovering over the ornate doorknob. Just as she was about to knock, Douglas emerged, his face contorted in rage. He brushed past Millie, his shoulder colliding with hers. She stumbled, catching a glimpse of the chaos within the room, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and a lingering scent of fear. Douglas didn't even acknowledge her presence, his footsteps echoing his anger as he stormed out of the apartment. The following morning, Millie went about her duties with a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She couldn't shake the image of Douglas's fury, the raw violence simmering beneath his polished exterior. As she cleaned the guest bathroom, her eyes were drawn to a disturbing sight: a blood-stained hand towel, carelessly discarded beneath the sink. Panic surged through Millie. She rushed to the guest bedroom door, her knuckles rapping against the polished wood. Silence met her inquiry, thick and heavy. Millie's heart pounded against her ribs. She tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Millie's voice shook with a fear she couldn't contain. Finally, she heard a shuffling sound, followed by the click of the lock disengaging. The door creaked open, revealing Wendy Garrick, her face pale and drawn, a dark bruise blooming on her cheekbone.
"He hurts you, doesn't he?" Wendy stood in the doorway, her eyes downcast, her body trembling. She tried to conceal the bruise with her hair, but Millie had seen enough. The silence was suffocating, a heavy truth unspoken.
Millie asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Wendy's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear and surprise. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked like a trapped animal, desperate to escape but too terrified to move. Millie had seen that look before, in countless women she'd helped escape. The fear, the shame, the paralyzing grip of silence. Millie had vowed never to stand idly by while another woman suffered in silence. Not again. Not this time. The sight of Wendy's bruised face unleashed a torrent of echoes in Millie's mind. Echoes, sharp and brutal, of her own brush with violence. The fear that had choked her, the desperate struggle, the sickening thud of flesh against bone. She'd been lucky, her attacker ending up dead, her own life forever marked by the encounter. She'd vowed then to never let fear paralyze her again. And she wouldn't stand by, not while another woman suffered. Wendy's silence was a plea for help, a silent scream echoing the terror she couldn't articulate. Millie knew she had to act, had to become the shield Wendy so desperately needed. She'd found strength in the echoes of darkness before, had clawed her way back from the brink. She would find a way again, for Wendy and for herself. "We have to get you out of here." Millie's voice was firm, resolute. The words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into the abyss of Wendy's fear. Wendy's eyes widened, a flicker of hope momentarily chasing away the shadows.
"He'll find me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He always finds me."
Millie knew she was right. Douglas Garrick had the resources to track down a runaway wife. They needed a plan, something more than just disappearing. Millie's mind raced back to her time with Enzo. He'd shown her the intricate workings of his network, the safe houses, the new identities.
"There has to be someone he doesn't know about," she pressed, her voice laced with urgency.
Wendy's brow furrowed, her mind sifting through the wreckage of her life, searching for a safe harbor.
"There's someone," she stammered. "An old college friend. She lives in Albany. She might help."
Albany. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. Millie knew she couldn't let fear paralyze her.
"We leave first thing tomorrow," Millie declared, her voice firm.
The drive to Albany was long, the silence punctuated by the hum of the engine. Millie rented a motel room, hoping it would provide a temporary haven. She left Wendy there, anxiety twisting in her gut.
"Stay put," she instructed, "and call your friend. Tell her everything."
Millie returned to the Garricks' penthouse with a knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. The empty apartment felt oppressive, the silence amplifying the echo of her fear. Had she done the right thing? Would Wendy's friend believe her story? Would she even be there? Millie jumped at every ring of the doorbell, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Then, just when the last vestiges of hope began to dwindle, the phone rang. Millie snatched it up, her breath catching in her throat. It was Douglas Garrick. His voice, usually smooth and controlled, was laced with a cold fury that sent a shiver down her spine.
"She's gone," he hissed, the words dripping with venom. "Where is she?"
"I think I messed up." Millie's blood ran cold. Douglas knew. He'd found out about their plan, and his anger was palpable. She fought to keep her voice steady. "Millie, I don't understand. Douglas, don't play coy with me." She left a note. Said you were trying to help her. Douglas, bring her back, or you'll regret it. Millie hung up the phone, her hand trembling. She had underestimated Douglas Garrick. He was dangerous, ruthless. She had to get to Wendy, had to warn her. But it was too late. Wendy, he found me. There's no escape. Despair threatened to consume Millie. She had risked everything to help Wendy, and now they were both trapped in Douglas Garrick's web of control. There had to be another way out of this nightmare. But what? Then, Wendy did something unexpected. She reached into her robe and pulled out a small, heavy object. It glinted under the dim light. It was a gun. Millie stared at the weapon, her stomach churning. But as she looked at Wendy's bruised face, a cold resolve settled in her heart. Millie, show me how to use it. The die is cast. The weight of the gun felt alien in Millie's hand, a cold metallic reminder of the darkness she'd sworn to leave behind. Her stomach churned as Wendy demonstrated the weapon's mechanics, her voice a detached monotone that sent chills down Millie's spine. Each click and snap of the mechanism felt like a betrayal of her own principles. Millie, I can't do this. She placed the gun on the table, the polished surface reflecting her own conflicted image. Wendy's eyes narrowed, her desperation morphing into a chilling resolve. Don't you see? It's him or us. Days turned into a blur of anxiety and dread. Millie tried to reason with Wendy, but her words fell on deaf ears. The gun remained on the table, a silent threat hanging over them. Millie constantly checked over her shoulder, bracing for the inevitable confrontation. One evening, as Millie was preparing dinner, she heard a commotion. Wendy's voice, shrill with terror, sliced through the air. Wendy Garrick. No, please, don't. Millie's blood ran cold. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet, her heart pounding. Douglas Garrick towered over Wendy, his hands around her throat. Wendy's eyes met Millie's, a silent plea for salvation. Millie knew she had to act before it was too late. The truth was undeniable. Adrenaline surged through Millie's veins, obliterating all thoughts but the desperate need to protect Wendy. She charged into the living room, the iron skillet raised high above her head. Millie Calloway. Get away from her! She screamed, her voice raw with fury. Douglas whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise. He released Wendy, who crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. Before he could react, Millie struck him with the skillet, the force of the blow echoing through the silent apartment. Douglas staggered backward, his eyes glazed with shock and pain. As Douglas lay on the floor, groaning, Millie noticed something peculiar. The man's face, contorted in pain, didn't seem familiar. It was subtly different from the man she'd seen in photographs, the man Wendy had introduced as her husband. A seed of doubt, tiny but persistent, began to sprout in Millie's mind. Who was this man? And what had she done? Wendy observed Millie's reaction, a smirk forming on her lips. She had anticipated Millie's breakdown, knowing she would yield to the fabricated story of abuse. Manipulating Millie had been effortless, exploiting her empathy and her instinct to shield the vulnerable. A few strategically placed bruises, some well-timed tears, and Millie was ensnared. It all began with a serendipitous meeting at an art gallery. Douglas Garrick, a man of wealth and power. He was captivated, deceived by her meticulously crafted persona. A whirlwind romance, an extravagant wedding, and Wendy was thrust into a life of opulence. The prenuptial agreement, a symbol of Douglas's practicality and her own cunning. $10 million if they ever separated. a small price to pay for a life of luxury. Section 2. The Accidental Assassin. The affair with Russell had been a desperate attempt to inject some excitement into her monotonous existence. He was handsome, attentive, a welcome distraction from the stifling reality of her marriage. But Douglas found out, his anger cold and calculating. He cut off her credit cards, stripped her of her extravagant lifestyle. Wendy had been trapped, her freedom purchased with her integrity. That's when the plan began to form, a desperate gamble to reclaim her life. She needed someone to eliminate Douglas, someone who could be manipulated. Someone like Millie. The gun, a prop in her twisted game, had been loaded with blanks. Millie's attack on Douglas, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to instill fear. It had worked perfectly. Millie had fled the apartment, convinced she had killed a man. As Wendy watched the news reports, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The face staring back at her from the television screen wasn't Douglas. It was a stranger, an uncanny resemblance, but a stranger nonetheless. Panic surged through her, cold and sharp. Who had Millie killed? She confronted Russell, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. He assured her that everything was under control, that the man in the apartment had been an associate. But doubt gnawed at Wendy's gut. Russell was a coward, a pawn in her game. What if he had made a mistake? She needed to know, needed to be certain. She had to find Millie, had to uncover the truth before it consumed her. The truth hit Millie like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her reeling in its wake. The man in the apartment, the man she had struck down with the iron skillet, wasn't Douglas Garrick. It was an imposter, a stand-in hired for a role in Wendy's twisted play. But who was he? And what had Wendy done with the real Douglas? She called Enzo, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and urgency. He listened patiently as Millie recounted the events of the past few weeks, the shocking revelation of the imposter. Enzo, with his underworld connections, was the only person she trusted to help her navigate this treacherous terrain. She told him about her encounter with Wendy in Albany, the frantic drive, the feeling that they were being watched. "I saw someone that day," she said, her voice catching in her throat. "Someone from my past. Enzo, I think he might be involved." Enzo moved with a quiet efficiency that belied the danger of their situation. He tracked down the imposter's real identity, a small-time actor named Russell Simons, and uncovered his connection to Wendy. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a chilling picture of manipulation, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder. But Russell had disappeared, vanished from his apartment without a trace. Enzo, however, had his ways of finding people who didn't want to be found. He discovered that Russell owned a secluded cabin in the woods, a perfect hideaway for a man on the run, and he had a feeling Wendy wouldn't be far behind. Millie knew what she had to do. She contacted Russell's wife, Mary Beth, a quiet, unassuming woman who had no idea of her husband's double life. Millie revealed the truth about Russell's infidelity, his involvement in Wendy's scheme, and the possibility that he might be in danger. Then, she handed Mary Beth a bottle of digoxin, the heart medication that both Douglas and Brock were prescribed. "He deserves to face justice," Millie said, her voice cold and steady. "But I can't be the one to deliver it." The news of Wendy's and Russell's deaths sent shockwaves through their social circle. The police, presented with a seemingly airtight case of murder-suicide, closed the investigation, attributing the tragedy to a toxic mix of infidelity, greed, and despair. Justice, of a sort, had been served. But it was a hollow victory, a secret pact of silence sealed in blood and deceit. Millie tried to move on, to rebuild her life from the wreckage of Wendy's lies. She found solace in Enzo's arms, his unwavering love a beacon of light in the darkness. 3 months after that fateful night, she moved into Enzo's apartment, leaving behind the ghosts of her past. But some scars run too deep to ever truly heal. The weight of her actions continued to haunt Millie's dreams. She was free from Wendy's manipulation, but the price of her freedom was a burden she would carry for the rest of her days.